My daughter yelled, "Leave or I'll call 911." So I called the last person she expected. That's what my own daughter shouted at me, standing in the doorway of the house I had worked 3 decades to pay for. She looked at me like I was an intruder, not the father who once carried her on his shoulders. All because of the man she married, a gambler sinking her future in lies. I walked away without another word, but I made one phone call that changed everything. I stood in front of my daughter's house, the evening air heavy in my chest. The porch light flickered above me, throwing shadows across the neat little garden I once helped her plant. The roses I had trimmed years ago were overgrown now, their petals hanging limp like my own heart. I raised my hand to knock, but the door swung open before I touched it. Sarah stood there, phone in one hand, her face tight with suspicion. Her voice came sharp, cutting right through me. "Leave, or I'll call 911." For a moment I thought I had misheard. My own daughter, who once clung to my leg at the county fair, now holding her phone like a weapon against me. I opened my mouth to speak, to remind her of the little girl who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms shook the windows. But her eyes were cold, steady, a mirror of the man she had married. I saw no trace of that child left in her expression. I wanted to beg, to shake her by the shoulders and say, "You are walking straight into disaster." But the words never left me. Instead, I felt something shift inside, not the usual pain that came when she snapped at me. No, this was harder, sharper, like steel setting in concrete. I gave a thin smile. My lips trembled, but I held it. She was expecting anger, maybe even tears. What she did not expect was calm. I turned without another word, my shoes crunching on the gravel path as I walked away. Behind me the door slammed, rattling the frame, shutting me out not just from her house, but from her world. I stopped by my truck parked at the curb. The old Ford groaned when I leaned against it, but it had never failed me, not once. I pulled out my phone, staring at the dark screen until my reflection stared back. Lines carved by years of overtime, sacrifices I never counted at the time. 30 years of breaking my back to give her a life safe and steady. Now she threatened me with the police for trying to protect it. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the low hum of televisions behind closed curtains. Families safe inside, dinners on the table, laughter probably echoing from living rooms. My own family, just a few feet away, had shut me out like a stranger. I thought about walking back, pounding on the door, forcing her to listen. But I knew better. I had seen that look in her eyes, the look of someone defending a choice even when it's killing them. She wasn't just Sarah anymore. She was Sarah with Ethan's hand gripping her shoulder, his voice whispering in her ear, his debts wrapped around her like a chain. I started the engine. The old truck rumbled to life, steady, dependable, like every foundation I ever poured, every wall I ever leveled. I gripped the wheel, staring at the glow of her house in the rearview mirror. The place she thought was safe, the place Ethan was dragging into ruin, and she wouldn't believe a word of it. I didn't drive away immediately. I sat there, engine idling, mind racing. My chest ached with betrayal, but somewhere under that ache was resolve. I couldn't outshout Ethan, and I couldn't outlove Sarah's blindness. But I could outlast both. My thumb slid across my phone screen, opening contacts. There were names there I hadn't touched in years. Old colleagues, men who had taught me how to read blueprints and contracts as carefully as scripture. I scrolled slowly, feeling my pulse settle. I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Through the windshield I caught one last glimpse of Sarah in the window, her figure framed by curtains, phone pressed to her ear, pacing the living room that I had helped her buy. She looked small in that big house, smaller than she ever realized. My heart twisted, but I didn't honk or wave. I simply put the truck in gear. As I eased away from the curb, I knew the path ahead would not be easy. She had chosen to see me as the enemy. Ethan had painted me as the meddling old man who didn't know when to quit. They thought my only weapons were words, and words had already failed. What they didn't know was that I had something stronger. The night deepened around me, streetlights flashing across the windshield as I drove. My fingers tapped the phone resting on the seat beside me. I had already decided who I would call first. Not Sarah, not Ethan. Someone who would understand exactly what leverage a man like me still carried. I whispered to the empty cab, as though the steel and fabric could listen. "You'll thank me one day, Sarah. Or you won't. But either way, I'm not letting you lose everything I built." The tires hummed against the asphalt, carrying me back toward my empty house. The battle had already begun. And this time, I wasn't walking away. I found him in the break room, right where I thought he'd be. The clock on the wall ticked past 3 in the afternoon, and the room smelled of burned coffee and reheated lunches. Ethan leaned against the counter, scrolling on his phone like he didn't have a care in the world. He didn't see me at first. I took my time, setting the folder of papers on the table, spreading them out like a dealer laying cards in a game he knew he'd already won. When he finally looked up, his smile froze. His eyes darted to the bank statements, the loan applications, the credit reports. The color drained from his face before anger rushed in to replace it. "Where the hell did you get these?" he snapped, snatching one of the pages, but his hands shook so badly he dropped it. I kept my voice steady, the same tone I'd used years ago when Cruz panicked over a cracked foundation. "The bank called my house by mistake. Late payment notice for your address." I tapped a finger against the page nearest me. $60,000, Ethan. All of it tied to Sarah's house. His jaw clenched, and he stepped closer. I could smell the mix of cologne and sweat clinging to him. His voice dropped, sharp like a knife. "This doesn't concern you, old man." "Doesn't concern me," I said, spreading the papers wider so he couldn't ignore them. "My daughter is about to lose her home because you can't keep away from poker sites, and you think that doesn't concern me?" He scoffed, but his eyes betrayed him. His flashy watch caught the overhead light as he swept the papers onto the floor. They fluttered down like autumn leaves scattered across the tile. "Stay out of my business, Robert. I handle my own affairs." I bent down, gathered the pages one by one, my hands steady even as my chest burned. "You mean the second mortgage? The equity line? The loan against her retirement? That's what you call your affairs?" He flinched just for a second, his mouth opened, but nothing came out. When he finally spoke, his voice wavered. "She knows." "Does she?" I pressed, standing tall, holding his gaze until he looked away. "Does she know about the latest credit application? Another 30,000 against her house." His eyes widened when I pulled my phone from my pocket and held up the screenshot. He lunged for it, desperate, but I stepped back. For a brief moment I saw something raw in his face. Not just anger, fear. "You don't understand," he muttered, the fight draining from his voice. "I had a system. It was working." "Your system is about to cost Sarah her home," I said. "Your daughter," he spat bitterly. "She's my wife. Time you figured that out." I slid my phone away, straightened my shoulders. The break room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. The hum of the vending machine in the corner seemed louder than ever. "I built the equity in that house," I said quietly. 30 years of overtime. 30 years of choosing mortgage payments over vacations and clothes and everything else. And you're gambling it away like it means nothing. His knuckles whitened around the mug he held. "Stay out of my business." "Or what?" I asked, not moving an inch. The mug slammed down so hard the ceramic cracked. Coffee spread across the table, creeping toward the edges, threatening to ruin the very papers I had just collected. His chest heaved, his breath ragged. "Just stay out." I tucked the damp papers back into my jacket, careful, deliberate. He stood there like a man cornered, his bravado cracked wide open. "I'm trying to help," I said. "I don't want your help." His voice was a growl now, low and dangerous. I nodded once, calm as stone, and turned for the door. Behind me his voice followed, hissing, desperate, calling after me to know my place, to mind my own business. I didn't answer. My mind was already racing ahead. Sarah would listen. She had to. And if she didn't, then I'd find another way. My watch read 3:30 as my footsteps echoed down the hall. She would be home soon, and Ethan wouldn't return until after 6. That gave me just enough time. I pushed open the heavy door to the parking lot, the late afternoon sun blinding for a moment. The engine of my truck ticked as it cooled, waiting. I slid inside, shut the door, and sat for a long breath. Through the windshield, I could still see Ethan's face in my mind, twisted with fear. For the first time since this all began, I knew one thing for certain. His grip on Sarah was built on lies, and lies never stand for long. I shifted into gear, the decision made. Tonight, my daughter would see the truth with her own eyes, and then we would see if her marriage was built on anything real at all. The drive back home felt longer than usual, even though I had taken the same road for decades. My hands gripped the wheel tight, knuckles pale under the fading light. The world outside looked ordinary enough. Kids riding bikes, sprinklers hissing over green lawns, neighbors dragging trash cans to the curb. But inside me, a storm raged. Ethan's face, full of lies and arrogance, kept flashing in my mind. And underneath that image, memories of what it had cost me to build the very foundation he was trying to gamble away. I thought about the years when Sarah was little. Back then I worked 2 jobs, one at the engineering firm by day and another shift at the concrete plant at night. I would come home with my hands cracked and raw, smelling of lime dust, but I never let her see how tired I was. She would sit on my lap with her school books while I tried to stay awake long enough to help her with homework. She'd ask why I missed dinner so often, and I'd tell her the truth in the simplest way I knew. Because we are paying for this house, sweetheart. Because one day it will all be yours. There was the summer when all her friends went to Disney World. She begged me for weeks, her eyes wide, her voice pleading. I wanted to say yes more than anything. But the water heater had gone out, and every dime had to go into plumbing repairs. We stayed home that year. I grilled hot dogs in the backyard and tried to make it feel special. She laughed and ran through the sprinklers, but I saw the disappointment in her eyes. I carried that guilt for years, but I reminded myself it was better to fix the pipes than drown in debt. Vacations passed us by. New clothes were bought from discount racks. My shoes had holes before I replaced them. But every month, without fail, the mortgage was paid, and more than the minimum, too. I learned early that paying a little extra meant knocking down the principal faster. I explained it to Sarah when she was just 7, sitting with me at the kitchen table, tracing numbers with her finger on the checkbook. If we pay 50 more now, I told her, we'll own this house sooner. Her little brow furrowed, and then she nodded like she understood compound interest before she could even spell it. It'll really be ours, she said. And I told her, yes, that's the point. Those memories stung now. The girl who once believed in every lesson I taught, now standing with a phone in her hand, ready to call the cops on me for trying to protect her. I thought of the nights I sat in the cab of my truck eating peanut butter sandwiches while everyone else at work ordered takeout. I thought of the Christmas when I gave her a bike, shiny and red, and she had no idea that it came at the cost of me skipping meals for weeks. I thought of her graduation, the moment she walked across that stage debt-free because I had worked myself half into the grave to make sure tuition was covered. And now Ethan, with his expensive watch and slick smile, was burning through all of it like dry leaves in a fire. Sarah could not see it, blinded by the promises he dangled in front of her. He bought her flat-screen televisions and fancy purses, all on credit. She mistook it for love. The steering wheel felt slick under my hands as I drove, sweat breaking on my forehead. I had always believed sacrifice was its own reward, that if you worked hard, stayed steady, life would give back. But looking at what had become of my sacrifices, I wondered if I had been a fool. The house was never just wood and drywall. It was the weight of every missed vacation, every aching muscle, every overtime shift I dragged myself through. It was nights away from Sarah so she could sleep safe under a roof that was paid for. That house was my life, poured into bricks and beams. And now it was at risk, not because of a storm or a fire, but because my daughter chose a man who thought debt was a game. I pulled into my driveway, shut off the truck, and sat there with the keys in my hand. My home was quiet, too quiet. like it always was these days. But I stared at it and thought of one thing. If Ethan wanted to gamble, let him gamble with his own money, not mine, not the roof I built for Sarah. I stepped out, the evening air pressing down heavy. My body ached with years of labor, but my mind was clear. I had given up too much to watch it slip away now. If Sarah could not remember the lessons I taught her, then I would remind her another way. I locked the truck, walked inside, and set the papers on my kitchen table. The old clock ticked on the wall. My sacrifices had built something solid, and I wasn't about to let a reckless man tear it down. One way or another, he was going to learn what 30 years of sacrifice was worth. I pulled into Sarah's driveway just as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gray. My truck ticked as the engine cooled, steady as my own heartbeat trying to stay calm. Through the front window, I saw the glow of the big flat screen Ethan had bragged about buying, the one that probably cost more than I ever spent on a vacation. I sat there a moment, planning it out the way I used to plan construction jobs. Step 1. Show her the documents. Step 2. Explain the danger. Step 3. Figure out a solution before it was too late. The front door opened before I even knocked. Sarah stood there, phone still in her hand. She hung up quickly and gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Dad, this is unexpected," she said, almost rehearsed. "We need to talk," I told her, and for a split second her smile faltered. She stepped aside and motioned toward the living room. The house smelled of expensive candles, something floral and sharp, but underneath it lingered the stale odor of fast food containers tossed aside. I noticed the empty soda cans on the coffee table, Ethan's gaming controllers scattered like toys. The place looked lived in but careless, a house without order. "Coffee?" she asked lightly, heading toward the kitchen before I could answer. "This is serious, Sarah," I told her. She paused at the doorway, her hand braced on the frame. "Fine, but I'm making coffee anyway. My hands need something to do when you start talking like this." I followed her in. The kitchen was bright, spotless in some corners and chaotic in others. A stack of unopened envelopes sat half hidden behind the toaster, the kind of envelopes that only come from banks and creditors. She fussed with the coffee maker, her back to me, refusing to look at the folder I had tucked under my arm. Wedding photos filled the refrigerator door. Ethan's arm was draped around her in every picture like he was staking a claim, while I barely appeared at all. I laid the folder on the counter and opened it, spreading the documents across the island. "I know about the gambling debts," I said firmly. The scoop slipped from her hand, beans scattering across the counter. "What gambling debts?" she whispered, though her voice cracked. "These." I tapped the statements, the loan applications, the credit lines, every one of them carrying Ethan's signature and all tied to her address. $60,000, Sarah, maybe more. She shook her head, her face pale. "That's impossible. It's right here." I pointed to the second mortgage, the equity line, the credit card advances. "Look for yourself." "No." She swept the papers off the island with a sudden burst of anger, scattering them across the tile floor. Brandon would never do that. He would never risk our house. Ethan did do that. The proof is right there. I crouched to pick up the pages, my knees stiff, my hands careful. She turned her back to me, clutching the counter like it was the only thing holding her up. "You made these up," she said sharply. "You never liked him. You never trusted him. You want to break us apart." I stood and held the papers again. "I want to save your house." "Our house is fine," she snapped, spinning around with tears in her eyes. "We've never been late on a payment." "Because you don't know about the other ones. 2,000 last month, 1,400 the month before. Where do you think that money came from?" "Stop it." She pressed her palms over her ears like a child. "Stop it right now. Sarah, he has borrowed against everything you own. Your car, your retirement, your house." "Stop." Her voice was rising, trembling. "Brandon loves me. He would never hurt me." "You're lying." Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, her breath quick and uneven. "I'm not lying, sweetheart," I said softly. "Don't call me that." Her eyes blazed, wet with tears. Don't you dare call me that. Get out of my house right now. Your house, I said, looking around at the furniture Ethan bought on credit, the unpaid bills hidden behind the toaster, the pictures that erased me from her life. I helped you buy this house, Sarah. I co-signed that mortgage when you couldn't qualify a loan. 30 years of my sweat went into the equity you're standing on. Get out, she shouted, raising her phone high, or I'll call the police and tell them you're harassing us. The words hit harder than any slap. Something inside me went cold. Not anger, not sadness, but something sharper. She expected me to beg. She expected me to shout. Instead, I simply folded the papers and tucked them back into my jacket. You'll call the police, I said quietly, on your father, who is trying to keep you from losing everything. You're not saving anything, she said, her voice shaking. You're trying to ruin my marriage. I stepped toward the door, slow and steady. At the doorway I paused, turned back just once. I hope Ethan is worth it, I said. He is. And I hope this house is too. I walked out without waiting for her reply, my footsteps heavy on the porch. Behind me, through the window, I saw her clutching the phone like it was a lifeline, her whole body trembling. The house glowed warm behind her, but all I felt was the chill of knowing she had chosen him over me. I climbed into my truck, started the engine, and drove away, already knowing what I had to do next. The drive home felt like I was carrying a weight in my chest that no seatbelt could hold back. The night air pressed against the windshield and the streetlights streaked by in blurred lines. I gripped the wheel tighter than I needed to, my knuckles stiff, because if I let go even a little, I was afraid my hands might shake. Sarah's voice still echoed in my ears, sharp and cold, telling me to get out, threatening to call the police. My own daughter, the little girl who once thought I hung the moon, now looking at me like I was a stranger trespassing in her life. I pulled into my driveway, shut off the engine, and sat in silence. The house was dark except for the soft glow from the kitchen window. My home had always been quiet, but tonight the silence cut deeper. I walked inside and set my jacket on the chair, the papers still tucked inside, damp from her kitchen counter. I stood there a long time, staring at the walls that held 30 years of sacrifice, 30 years of memories, and it all came flooding back at once. I saw Sarah at 8 years old, running barefoot through the backyard, chasing fireflies while I sat on the steps, too tired to join her but smiling anyway. I saw her standing in the driveway the day I gave her that red bicycle, squealing with joy as she wobbled down the sidewalk. She never knew that gift meant I skipped my own meals for weeks. She only saw the bike, shiny and bright, and the way I cheered when she finally learned to ride without training wheels. I remembered the nights I came home, bone-tired from double shifts, my back screaming from hours of lifting rebar, my hands cracked from cement burns. She would be waiting at the table with her math homework spread out, asking me to help. I wanted nothing more than to crawl into bed, but instead I sat with her, guiding her small hand as she traced the numbers, patient even when my eyelids drooped. She would smile up at me, gap-toothed and trusting, as if her dad could fix anything. The years blurred together after that. Late nights balancing the checkbook at the kitchen table, every dollar accounted for, every sacrifice justified. Vacations never taken, new cars never bought, overtime shifts grabbed whenever I could. All so Sarah could go to college without a mountain of debt. All so she could stand on her own someday. I carried the weight gladly, because I believed she would remember the lessons. But tonight in that kitchen, staring at me with tears of anger, she called me a liar. She told me to leave her house, a house I had helped her secure with my own signature. She clutched her phone like I was a threat, not a father. That image hurt worse than any broken bone ever could. I sat in my recliner and looked at the graduation photo on the shelf. Sarah in her cap and gown, smiling proudly, debt-free because I had worked myself into exhaustion to make it happen. I could still hear her words from that day. "Thank you, Dad. I'll never forget what you did for me." But she had forgotten. Somewhere between wedding dresses and Ethan's promises, she had let those lessons slip away. My eyes burned as I thought of the nights I spent in the cab of my truck with a sandwich while others ordered steaks. I thought of the Christmases when gifts were small, but the mortgage was always paid. I thought of the look on her face when she moved into that house, believing it was the American dream, never realizing it was built on my sweat and my sacrifices. Now she believed Ethan's lies more than my truth. She believed a man who wore a shiny watch and lived on credit over the father who had never once missed a payment in 30 years. That realization cut me in two. I leaned forward, buried my face in my hands, and for the first time in a long while, I let the tears come. Not loud, not heavy, just quiet and steady, like the drip of a leaky faucet. I wasn't crying for myself. I was crying for the little girl who used to trust me, who used to hold my hand and believe every word I said. Somewhere along the way I had lost her. But even as I sat there with my head bowed, I felt something else stir inside me. Beneath the grief, beneath the heartbreak, there was a hardness forming. A resolve I hadn't felt since the days I fought to pay down that mortgage dollar by dollar. If Sarah couldn't see the truth through love, then she would see it through consequences. I lifted my head, wiped my face, and looked around my quiet house. The walls held every sacrifice, every memory. I wasn't about to let Ethan turn those years into ashes. If Sarah hated me for what I was about to do, then so be it. Better she hate me now than lose everything later. The papers in my jacket rustled when I stood. They weren't just papers anymore. They were the key to reminding Sarah of everything she had forgotten, and I was ready to use them. I could not sleep that night. I sat in my recliner long after the house had gone still, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. My mind ran in circles, replaying Sarah's voice, the way her eyes burned with anger, the way she lifted that phone as if I were some intruder in her life. I thought of Ethan's face, too, red with fear when I showed him the numbers. For a while I felt trapped between them, powerless, but then I remembered something I had almost forgotten myself. I stood and walked to my study. The room smelled faintly of paper and dust, the way it always did, and the filing cabinet sat in the corner like a guard dog, heavy and immovable. That cabinet held 30 years of my life. Every receipt, every contract, every mortgage statement sorted and labeled. I opened the top drawer, and the files whispered against one another as I pulled them forward. My fingers knew the weight of the folder before my eyes confirmed it. Sarah's house. The folder was thick, stuffed with documents from the first conversations with the bank to the most recent tax receipts. I carried it to the desk, flipped on the lamp, and let the light flood over the papers. My hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the feeling that I was about to uncover something important. Page after page, there it was. Loan applications, appraisals, closing disclosures. Each one had their signatures. Sarah's neat and careful, Ethan's sloppy and rushed. But at the bottom of the biggest document, the original mortgage, another signature waited. Mine, bold, clean, written in my engineer's print the way I had written blueprints for decades. Next to it, a line that made my chest tighten with both dread and relief. Co-borrower Michael Turner, joint and several liability. I read the phrase over and over until the words seemed to glow under the lamp. Joint and several liability. That meant I was not just a guarantor, not just a parent lending his name. I was a legal owner of that house. My signature gave me rights that Ethan had never considered, rights that Sarah had forgotten. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking beneath me, and stared at the ceiling. All those years ago, when the loan officer slid the papers across the desk, I had hesitated. I remember the smell of that office, fresh coffee and carpet glue, the way Sarah's hand slipped into mine. "Please, Dad," she had whispered, her eyes wide with hope. "We'll never miss a payment." Ethan nodded quickly, eager to get the keys, promising it was just a formality. I had signed because I wanted to give her what she wanted, because she was my little girl and I couldn't stand the thought of crushing her dream. Now that decision, which I had regretted more than once, stood before me as a shield. My name was not just scribbled ink. It was stone set into the foundation of her house, as much a part of it as the beams and studs. Ethan could gamble until his hands shook, but he could not erase me. I spread the documents out again, lining them side by side. The numbers were ugly, the debts staggering, but the law was clear. If Ethan thought he could strip that house bare without me noticing, he was wrong. If Sarah thought she could push me out of her life and still keep my signature hidden away in a drawer, she was mistaken. I was there from the beginning, and the law said I would be there to the end. The thought steadied me. For the first time since Sarah told me to get out, I felt the ground solid beneath my feet. It was the same feeling I used to get on construction sites, when the concrete finally set, when the foundation was hard enough to build on. I sat forward, elbows on the desk, staring at the mortgage. I could hear Ethan's voice again, mocking me, telling me it was his house, his business. But the paper in front of me told a different story. This wasn't just their house, it was mine too. The clock ticked closer to midnight. The citrus trees outside swayed in the breeze, branches brushing against the window like they were trying to remind me of something. I had a choice to make. Walk away. Let Sarah and Ethan bury themselves in debt until the bank came for the house, or step forward and use the leverage I still held. I closed the folder carefully, slid it back into its place in the drawer, and shut it with a firm click. My heart was steady now. I had found the forgotten signature, and with it, my path forward. As I turned off the lamp and left the study, the darkness did not feel so heavy. Ethan thought he had control. Sarah thought I was powerless, but both of them had overlooked the truth. My name was written into the very bones of that house, and that meant the fight had only just begun. The morning after I found the mortgage papers, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. The sun slipped through the blinds in narrow stripes across my bedroom wall, and for once I didn't feel the heaviness of doubt pressing down on me. I knew what I had to do. I showered, shaved, and put on a clean shirt, the kind of ritual I used to follow before big meetings on the job. Old habits of preparing for battle. This time the battleground wasn't concrete and steel. It was the law. I drove downtown, the streets busy with people rushing to offices, coffee cups in hand, briefcases swinging at their sides. It reminded me of the years I commuted before retirement, each day starting with the weight of deadlines. My stomach tightened as I parked in front of Wallace and Associates. Mark Wallace had been a friend of mine for years, a man I trusted. We had met when he bought a small property and I helped him with the structural work. Since then, he had risen to become one of the sharpest real estate attorneys in town. If anyone could tell me what power my forgotten signature carried, it was him. His office sat on the 12th floor of a glass building that overlooked the city. Inside, the air smelled faintly of leather and fresh paper. Diplomas lined the walls in neat frames. The secretary led me back to his office, and when I stepped inside, Mark rose from behind a wide oak desk, his hand extended. "Michael," he said warmly, "good to see you. It's been a while." "Not long enough," I answered with a tired smile. "I wish this were a social visit." He gestured for me to sit, and I placed the thick folder of documents on his desk. His eyes sharpened immediately. He had seen enough of these to know when someone was in trouble. "Tell me what's going on," he said. I took a deep breath and laid it all out. Ethan's gambling, the loans, the second mortgage, the credit lines, and finally the way Sarah had turned on me when I tried to warn her. My voice caught at times, but I forced myself to keep steady. Mark listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I finished, I opened the folder and pushed the original mortgage across the desk. He leaned forward, scanned the pages, and then looked up at me with a calm expression that carried weight. "Michael, do you realize what you have here?" I nodded slowly. "I think I do." He tapped the line where my signature Saturday joint and several liability he read aloud. "This doesn't just make you a guarantor. You are a co-owner, which means you have standing in any major decision involving this property. Refinancing, loans, even sale. They cannot do it without you." I felt the words settle inside me like heavy bricks, solid and unshakable, so I can stop him. Yes, Mark said firmly. You can stop him, or you can take control yourself, if necessary. In cases like this, when debts are spiraling, the law allows you to initiate what's called a partition action. It forces a sale of the property and divides the proceeds between co-owners. The thought hit me like cold water. Forcing the sale meant stripping Sarah of her home. It meant breaking whatever was left of her trust. But it also meant protecting the 30 years of equity I had poured into that house, the lifetime of sacrifice Ethan thought he could gamble away. Mark must have seen the conflict in my face. He leaned back, his voice softer. Michael, I know this isn't easy, but right now Ethan is using your name to sink both of you deeper. If you do nothing, the bank will come. You'll lose more than Sarah realizes. I stared at the window, the city stretching wide below us. Cars crawled like ants on the streets. Somewhere down there, Sarah was probably still angry, convinced I was the villain in her marriage. But from up here, with the law spelled out in black and white, I saw the truth more clearly. What would you do if it were your daughter? I asked quietly. Mark sighed, his eyes steady. I'd protect what I built, even if it meant she hated me for a while. Sometimes love looks like surrender. Other times it looks like standing firm when no one else will. I nodded slowly. My hands tightened on the arms of the chair. For 30 years I had worked so Sarah could stand on solid ground. Now that ground was crumbling beneath her feet, and she was too blinded by love to see it. If she wouldn't listen to me as her father, then she would hear me through the law. Mark closed the folder, slid it back to me. When you're ready, we'll file. Think it over this weekend. I stood, shook his hand, and felt the weight of decision pressing against my chest. I walked out of his office, down the hall lined with law books and quiet power, and into the bright glare of the afternoon Sunday. As I drove home, the folder sat beside me on the passenger seat. It was no longer just paper. It was leverage. It was the foundation Ethan had ignored, the one Sarah had forgotten. And now it was mine to use. I gripped the wheel tighter, my jaw set. I had tried pleading. I had tried warning. Now I would use the one thing they couldn't argue with, the law. It was close to midnight when the pounding started. 3 heavy knocks shook the front door, followed by silence, then 3 more. I sat up straight in my recliner, the lamp still burning beside me. My heart kicked once, hard, then steadied. I already knew who it was. Through the peephole, his face filled the glass. Ethan, flushed, his shirt wrinkled, eyes wide and bloodshot. His hair stuck to his forehead like he had been running his hands through it all night. The porch light cast shadows across his face, making him look even more desperate. "Open the door," he barked, his voice carrying through the wood. I slid the chain loose enough to crack it open an inch. "Evening, Ethan," I said calmly. He pressed his palm against the frame, leaning close to the gap. "Don't play games with me. Open this door right now." "It's open enough for a conversation," I answered. He smelled of cologne and liquor, the 2 scents clashing as he leaned in, his breath hot through the narrow opening. "Sarah told me about your stunt," he hissed. "Your fake documents, your little conspiracy theories. Did she also tell you about the 60,000 in gambling debts?" I asked. His face darkened. "Those aren't gambling debts. They're investments. Crypto, real estate, opportunities you wouldn't understand." "Strange," I said quietly. "Last I checked, poker sites don't deal in real estate." His jaw twitched. "You don't know what you're talking about, old man." I pulled out my phone, held it where he could see the screen glowing. "Should I call Sarah? Let her hear your business pitch." His hand shot forward like he might snatch it, but he stopped himself at the last second. "Don't you dare. You're already drowning her, Ethan. I haven't done a thing." "You've done enough," he snapped. "You're poisoning her against me." "No," I said evenly. "Your gambling is doing the damage." He slammed his palm flat against the door, the sound echoing through the hallway. "It's not gambling," he shouted. "I had a system. I was making money until he stopped himself. words hanging in the air. "Until what?" I asked, my voice low. His eyes darted side to side, sweat running down his temple. "Just stay out of our lives. No more visits, no more paperwork, no more meddling." "Or what?" I asked again, not moving back. His smile spread thin and flat. "Or things get unpleasant. Lonely old men, accidents happen." The words came out slick, but his eyes gave him away. He was scared, cornered, lashing out. I had seen the same look on job sites when contractors knew the project was slipping out of their hands. "Are you threatening me?" I asked. "I'm explaining reality," he muttered, leaning closer, his face nearly pressed against the narrow opening. "Sarah and I are happy. We're handling our finances. You're not needed, not wanted, not welcome." "Interesting perspective," I said, my voice steady. "It's the only one that matters." He straightened his wrinkled shirt, trying to regain the appearance of control, but his hands twitched at his sides. "Stay away from us, Michael. I mean it." I closed the door until the chain tightened and he was forced to step back. I watched through the peephole as he turned, stumbling a little, and walked down the steps to the car parked crooked at the curb. A Mercedes gleaming under the streetlight, the kind of car he couldn't possibly afford. He slammed the door and the engine roared, tires squealing as he tore off into the night. I locked the deadbolt and slid the chain back into place. The house went quiet again, but the silence felt different now, charged with something heavier. His words hadn't scared me. They had confirmed what I already knew. He was unraveling. His debts were eating through him like acid, stripping away his judgment until threats were all he had left. I walked back to the study and stood in front of the filing cabinet, my hand resting on the drawer that held Sarah's folder. I could almost hear his voice in my ear, sneering about accidents. I had spent 40 years handling men like him, men who promised the impossible and turned violent when their lies collapsed. I wasn't about to start backing down now. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the contact I had saved. Mark Wallace's number glowed on the screen. Tomorrow I would call him. Tonight I would rest, because the battle was shifting. Ethan thought intimidation would silence me, but all he had done was prove how desperate he was. I shut off the lamp, the room plunging into shadows. Outside, the neighborhood was still, not a car moving, not a dog barking, only the echo of his engine fading down the street. I stood there in the dark a long time, breathing steady, my resolve firming with every passing second. If Ethan wanted a war, then he had just declared it, and I was ready. Monday morning came gray and heavy, the kind of sky that looks like poured concrete. I dressed in my navy suit, the same one I had worn to Sarah's wedding, the same one that still carried faint creases no ironing could fix. I stood in front of the mirror a long time, staring at myself, wondering how a father ended up here. Not as a guest at his daughter's dinner table, not as a trusted voice in her life, but as a plaintiff walking into court. The courthouse loomed downtown, its limestone columns weathered but unyielding. The building had been standing for 100 years and looked like it could stand for 100 more. I parked in a metered spot and walked slowly across the steps, the weight of the folder tucked under my arm. Inside, the air was cool, the floors polished so bright I could see my reflection. Security guards scanned bags, metal detectors beeped, and the hum of printers and chatter filled the halls. Lives being sorted into categories, divorces, bankruptcies, custody battles, and now mine. Mark was waiting for me by the clerk's office, briefcase in hand. "You ready?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "I've been ready for a long time." We sat at a long table beneath buzzing fluorescent lights while he spread out the paperwork. "Petition for partition by sale," he explained, his finger pointing down the page. "You are listed as co-owner, Sarah and Ethan as defendants. Full property details, current liens, debt balances. Once this is stamped, the process begins." I read every word, slowly, the way I had read blueprints all my life. My name stared back at me in bold letters. Plaintiff. No longer Dad. No longer Michael the father. Plaintiff Michael Turner, co-owner. It stripped away all excuses, all arguments. This was no longer family drama. It was law. The clerk took the stack, flipped through it, and stamped each page with a heavy thud that echoed in my chest. The sound was final, like the closing of a vault door. Case number CV 2025-112, she recited, sliding the copies back to us. Initial hearing April 16th, courtroom B, 9 a.m. Defendants will be served within 5 business days. I wrote the date in my small notebook, the same one I used to jot measurements on job sites. The pen didn't shake. My hand was steady, almost too steady. This was no longer guesswork. This was the foundation set in stone. As we walked out, Mark said quietly, "They'll be served by Friday. Once they are, they can't refinance or transfer anything. The lis pendens freezes all major moves until this case is resolved." The words settled over me like steel beams sliding into place. It was no longer a matter of begging Sarah to believe me. The law would hold the ground steady now, no matter how hard Ethan tried to wriggle free. Outside, the sky had not brightened. Clouds hung low, gray, and heavy, but I felt lighter than I had in weeks. My shoes clicked against the pavement as we walked to the parking lot. I shook Mark's hand, his grip firm. "I'll call you after they're served," he promised. Driving home, I kept the radio low, just a faint hum under my thoughts. For the first time in months, their chaos couldn't touch me. They could scream, they could threaten, they could deny, but the machine was moving forward. When I got home, I placed the certified copies in Sarah's folder, right behind the original mortgage. I closed the drawer with care, the sound of metal sliding against metal sharp and certain. Then I sat at the kitchen table, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and stared at the steam rising. I thought of Sarah's voice on the phone, telling me to get out, to stop meddling. I thought of Ethan at my door, his face red with liquor, muttering about accidents. Both of them had pushed me to this point. I had tried to talk, I had tried to warn, and they had slammed the door in my face. Now the law would do the talking. The house was quiet, but the quiet felt different this time. Not hollow, not lonely, solid. The kind of quiet you get when the foundation has finally been poured and the forms pulled away, leaving concrete hard enough to build on. I leaned back in my chair and let the silence wrap around me. Somewhere across town, Sarah and Ethan were living in their bubble, unaware that the papers would be arriving soon. They still believed I was just an old man with warnings they could ignore. They had no idea their names were now written into a case file, their future stamped by the clerk's heavy hand. I sipped my coffee and smiled faintly. They had turned me into an enemy in their story, but what they didn't understand was that I wasn't fighting as a father anymore. I was fighting as a co-owner who had worked too hard, too long, to watch 30 years of sacrifice vanish. The machine was in motion, and there was no stopping it now. The calls started the same afternoon the papers were delivered. I was trimming the citrus trees in the backyard when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Sarah's name lit up the screen. For a long moment I just stared at it, the sun catching the glass, my reflection staring back at me. I let it ring. A minute later it buzzed again. And again. By the end of the hour I had 5 missed calls and 1 voicemail waiting. I went inside, poured a glass of water, and finally pressed play. Her voice came through shaky, trembling like she had been crying. "Dad, please. We got papers from the court. I don't understand what this is. Brandon says you're trying to take our house." "That can't be true. Call me back." I set the phone down on the counter and stared at the sink, the water dripping slow from the faucet. Her words were soft, pleading, but underneath them I could still hear the defiance from the night she told me to get out. I wanted to call her, to explain it all again, but I remembered how she had covered her ears, shouting for me to stop. She didn't want the truth then. Why would she want it now? That evening another voicemail came through. Brandon's voice this time, hard and bitter. "What game are you playing, old man? Family doesn't drag family to court. You think you can embarrass us like this? You're making a mistake bigger than you know." His anger rolled through the speaker. But I had heard anger like that before, on job sites, in union halls, in meetings when numbers didn't line up. It was the anger of a man who knew he had lost control. I deleted the message without saving it. Sarah's calls kept coming through the next day, her voice breaking in each one. Brandon says you forged those papers. Tell me that isn't true. Please, Dad, tell me you're not trying to steal from us. I love you, but this is too much. We can fix this if you just stop. Please don't make me choose. The words cut deep, sharper than I wanted to admit. Don't make me choose, as if I had forced her hand. As if Ethan's gambling and lies were just mistakes to be brushed aside, but my decision to protect 30 years of work was betrayal. I walked around the house restless, her voice echoing in my ears. I had built this home brick by brick, memory by memory, and now my own daughter was begging me to undo the only step that could keep her safe. By Friday, the calls turned frantic. 10 in one day, each one more desperate. The voicemails piled up, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. Dad, please answer. Brandon says the judge won't side with you. He says this will ruin our credit, our marriage, everything. You don't want that, do you? Please, I'm begging you. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder open, the stamped court papers staring back at me. My coffee had gone cold, untouched. I replayed one message after another, my chest tightening. Each word pulled at me, but each word also reminded me why I had done this in the first place. She had chosen to stand beside Ethan when he lied. She had chosen to believe him when I showed her the proof. Now the law would show her what I could not. Late that night, close to midnight, the phone rang again. I thought about silencing it, but something made me let it go to voicemail. Brandon's voice came through, low and steady this time. You're making a mistake you can't walk back, bigger than you know. I saved that one. Not because it scared me, but because it confirmed what I already felt in my gut. He was panicking. Men like him shout, then they threaten, then they beg. The shouting was behind us. The threats were running thin. What came next would be desperation. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow above me. Sarah's words pressed against my heart, but the clerk's heavy stamp echoed louder in my ears. She could call 100 times, leave 1,000 messages, but the process was moving. The papers were filed, the date was set, and nothing she said could erase the truth. I turned on my side, closed my eyes, and whispered into the empty room. I'm sorry, Sarah. One day you'll see I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to save what we built. The phone buzzed again on the nightstand. I let it. The law was speaking now, and I had no more words left to give. The night after the threats and the pleading, I sat in my living room staring at the walls. The quiet of my house felt different than before. It was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of a man being watched, a man waiting for the next knock at the door. Every creak in the wood made me glance toward the windows. Every car that slowed outside made my pulse jump. I had handled rough men before in my life, but there was something about Ethan's eyes that told me he was desperate enough to do something foolish. I walked through each room that evening, switching on the lights, checking the locks. My house had been my sanctuary for decades, but it no longer felt safe. The pictures on the mantel, the tools in the garage, the chair where I always sat with my morning coffee, all of it suddenly felt fragile. I thought about the citrus trees out back, heavy with fruit, the garden Sarah used to help me tend when she was small. What if he came here while I slept? What if his anger spilled over the edge? By the next morning I made up my mind. I would leave this place for a while. Not forever, just long enough for the court process to take its course. It was not fear that drove me, but caution. I had seen what desperate men do when the walls close in. I was not about to give Ethan a chance to corner me in my own home. I found a furnished apartment downtown, Cypress Point Apartments. Nothing fancy, just a modest unit with beige carpet and plain furniture. But the building had coded entry, security cameras in the lobby, and neighbors who minded their own business. The manager gave me keys to Unit 2B and a parking space in the garage. I handed over the deposit without hesitation. Back at my house, I packed 3 suitcases and a box of files. I left most of it behind: the photos, the old recliner, the worn dining table I had sanded myself 30 years ago. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, checking the windows one last time. It felt like saying goodbye to an old friend who had stood by me for decades. I whispered a promise under my breath. I'll be back when this is finished. On Friday morning, I loaded the truck and drove downtown. The city noise swallowed me as I parked in the underground garage. Carrying my bags up the narrow stairwell, I opened the door to 2B. The apartment smelled faintly of fresh paint and cleaning supplies. No history in the walls, no echoes of laughter or arguments, just emptiness waiting to be filled. I unpacked slowly. Clothes in the dresser, toothbrush by the sink, legal files stacked neatly on the desk by the window. I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed and listened. No creaks, no whispers of memory, just the muffled sound of traffic outside. For the first time in weeks, my phone was silent. No angry knocks at the door, no shadow of Ethan's Mercedes prowling past. Only stillness. That night I cooked a simple meal on the electric stove, sat at the small table, and ate in quiet. I looked out the window at the courthouse clock tower lit against the night sky 6 blocks away, close enough that I could see it every day, a reminder of what was coming. The next morning I woke early, made coffee with the little drip machine, and sat by the window. The view was plain, rooftops and asphalt, nothing like the green of my backyard, but it was safe. I breathed easier knowing only Mark and the court clerk knew where I was. Ethan and Sarah could call my house 100 times, bang on the door until their fists bled, and they would find nothing but silence. I walked the block around the building that afternoon, nodding at strangers who passed me without a second glance. I was invisible here, just another older man living out his days quietly. I liked it that way. But as I settled into the sterile apartment, a pang cut through me. This was not the home I had built. This was not the place where Sarah had taken her first steps, or where she had brought home drawings from school, or where she had cried after her first heartbreak. This was a shell, a temporary bunker. Safe, yes, but empty. I stood at the window again, as the courthouse bells tolled. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, tired but resolute. I had given my whole life to build a foundation strong enough to hold my family. Now I was living in a place that felt like borrowed time. Still, the choice was made. I would wait here, safe and steady, while the process moved forward. Sarah and Ethan could rage, could beg, could threaten, but the law was already in motion. And in this quiet, empty apartment, I would find the strength to see it through to the end. The call came on a Wednesday morning as I sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment, sipping coffee that tasted thin compared to what I made at home. Thomas, the real estate agent Mark recommended, spoke with a calm tone that carried no judgment. The appraiser finished the report, he said. The market's steady. With the neighborhood, the house should list quickly. I thanked him and hung up, staring at the phone a long moment before setting it down. My hand rested on the legal folder beside my mug. It was happening now. The house that had once been my pride, the place where Sarah used to play on the porch, was being measured and photographed for strangers. Later that day I drove by, staying a block away, careful not to be seen. I watched from a distance as a man with a clipboard walked around the yard, snapping pictures, jotting notes. The neighbors peeked through curtains, whispering. Mrs. Thompson from 2 doors down stood openly at her fence, arms crossed, shaking her head. To them it probably looked like foreclosure, like Sarah and Ethan were losing everything because they had stretched too far. They didn't know the truth, but the truth wasn't much prettier. Through the window I could see Sarah sitting stiff on the couch, arms wrapped around herself, her eyes locked on the man in the yard. Ethan paced the kitchen, phone glued to his ear, jaw tight, movements sharp. Even from where I sat in my truck, I could feel the tension bleeding from those walls. 2 days later, the listing went live. I opened the email on my laptop in the apartment. Photos of every room filled the screen. The living room looked larger than it ever did in person, the photographer's wide lens making it seem bright and airy. The kitchen gleamed, counters cleared, the bills that once piled near the toaster hidden away. Staging had been done. The flowers on the table weren't Sarah's. The throw pillows on the couch weren't hers either. Their life had been scrubbed down and replaced with something generic and inviting for buyers. My chest tightened as I clicked through each image. The upstairs bedroom where Sarah had once begged me to paint the walls yellow. The backyard where I had built her a swing set out of leftover lumber. Now those spaces were just selling points on a listing sheet. The asking price was fair, maybe even low, to attract buyers quickly. Within a day, Thomas called again. "We already have showings lined up," he said. "2 investors and a family moving from out of state." I thanked him again, though my voice caught. After the call, I sat back in the chair, staring out the window of the apartment at the gray street below. I thought about Ethan telling me once that I was old-fashioned, that I didn't understand how money worked anymore. He had mocked me for saving, for clipping coupons, for choosing work boots over fancy watches. And now here he was, forced into a fire sale, his home becoming bait for buyers because of the very debts he swore he could handle. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. Just 4 words. "Dad, please call me." I didn't. The law was moving now, and my words had already failed too many times. On Saturday morning, I drove past the house again. Cars lined the curb. Strangers walked up the driveway with brochures in hand. An agent in a sharp suit held the door open, greeting them with a polished smile. From my truck, I watched as one couple walked through the backyard, pointing, nodding, imagining their own lives there. I wondered if Sarah was inside, hiding in the bedroom while strangers opened her closets and measured the walls with their eyes. I sat there longer than I should have, then started the engine and drove away. I didn't want her to see me. I didn't want to see her tears. Back at the apartment, I poured another coffee and spread the papers on the desk. The appraiser's report sat on top, neat and clinical. It listed square footage, upgrades, comparable sales, ending with a market value that made my stomach turn. $437,000. A number on a page, cold and exact. But to me, it was more than a number. It was decades of sacrifice, weekends missed, backaches that never went away, birthdays I worked through just to keep the payments steady. I leaned back, rubbed my eyes, and whispered to myself, "Let them see what value really looks like." Outside, the courthouse tower stood against the skyline, steady and unmoved. My phone buzzed again. Another call I didn't answer. Sarah and Ethan could beg, could rage, but the truth was already written into law. The house was for sale, and nothing would stop it now. The note was waiting for me when I stopped by the old house to check the mail I had not forwarded yet. It was tucked under the doormat, the handwriting shaky but familiar. My heart clenched before I even opened it. Inside, Sarah's words spilled across the page. "Dad, please, we're out of time. We found an apartment but need first month, last month, deposit, moving costs. Brandon is trying to get a loan, but his credit is ruined. Please talk to us. Don't make us homeless. Love, Sarah." I stood on the porch reading it over and over. The ink blurred in a few spots where her tears must have fallen. My hands shook slightly as I folded it and slid it into the folder with the rest of the case documents. It was evidence now, not just a plea. Back at the apartment, my phone buzzed with new messages. I listened to the first one, Brandon's voice, smaller than I had ever heard it. "Michael, look, I admit I messed up. I gambled too much. I'll get help, I promise. Counseling, meetings, whatever you want. Just stop this lawsuit. We'll pay you back over time." Another message followed. Sarah this time. "Dad, I was wrong to threaten you. I know I said things I shouldn't have, but forcing us to sell will destroy us. Please, give us another chance. Brandon is trying. We can fix this." I sat at the desk with the folder open, their words echoing in my ears. They sounded broken, desperate, voices stripped of the defiance they had carried before. For a moment, my resolve wavered. I could see Sarah as a child again, clutching my hand on her first day of school, asking if everything would be okay. I could see her crying after her first heartbreak, and me sitting beside her telling her she would survive. Part of me wanted to pick up the phone and say it would all be okay again. But then I saw Ethan's face the night he showed up at my door, drunk and furious, muttering about accidents. I heard Sarah's voice telling me to get out, threatening to call the police on me. I remembered the stack of bills hidden in her kitchen, the debts piling up in my name. Their pleas did not erase those truths. I poured a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and let the courthouse tower steady me. Mercy had gotten us here. Every chance I gave Ethan turned into another loan, another gamble, another lie. If I stopped now, it would start all over again. That evening, another voicemail came. Brandon again, his voice shaking. "Michael, we're begging you. Just meet us once, face to face. We'll work something out like family. You don't need the courts." "Family?" I whispered to the empty apartment. Where was family when Sarah told me to leave her house? Where was family when Ethan sneered in my face about business investments that were nothing but poker debts? I turned off the ringer and set the phone aside. Their words no longer had the power to move me. The process was already in motion, the sale already attracting buyers. Their promises came too late. The next morning I slipped the note from Sarah into a clear sleeve and filed it behind the appraiser's report. The folder was thick now, a record of every step, every lie, every desperate attempt to pull me back into silence. I ran my hand over the cover and felt the weight of it. They could cry, they could beg, they could write letters and leave notes, but the truth was simple. Actions had consequences. I had given them every chance to face the problem with honesty, and they had chosen denial every time. Now the law would carry the weight, not me. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, the morning sun reflecting off the courthouse tower. For the first time in months, I felt a calm certainty settle in my chest. Their pleas were not enough, their promises too thin. I had built my life on foundations that held, and I would not let their reckless hands tear them apart. I turned back to the desk, closed the folder, and whispered the words I knew they would never want to hear. Too late. The closing was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I woke early, put on the navy suit again, the same one I had worn when Sarah walked down the aisle. I straightened the tie she had given me years ago for Father's Day, and stared into the mirror. My hair had thinned since then. My face carried more lines, but my eyes were steady. I had been through too much to falter now. The courthouse conference room was sterile, fluorescent lights buzzing above, the air faintly smelling of copier toner and dust. A long table waited with neat stacks of documents, each page a nail in the coffin of what used to be Sarah's dream. Thomas the realtor was there, calm and efficient. Mark handled the legal side, his briefcase snapping open like a toolbox before a job. Across the table sat the buyer's attorney, flipping through papers with mechanical precision. The clerk read the numbers aloud. Sale price, $425,000. Mortgage balance, $293. Additional liens and debts, $52. Legal fees, commissions, deductions. Final proceeds to plaintiff Michael Turner, $78,437. The numbers echoed in the hollow room. I signed where they told me to sign. Each stroke of the pen felt heavier than the last. My name, written over and over, no longer as father, but as co-owner taking back what was his. When it was done, the clerk gathered the pages, stamped them with finality, and slid a copy toward me. The sound of that stamp was louder than Sarah's shouts, louder than Ethan's threats. It was the sound of justice landing. By noon, my phone buzzed with confirmation. The deposit cleared. $78,000 sat in my account, the largest sum I had seen at once since before retirement. I stared at the number on the screen, my hand tight around the phone. It was not joy I felt, not even pride. It was a deep calm, the kind that comes when a job is finished exactly as it was drawn on paper. Outside, the sky was clear and blue, the air warm for April. I walked to the parking lot with the documents under my arm. Thomas shook my hand firmly. "A pleasure working with you, mister." "Turner," he said. Mark was more direct. "Justice served." I nodded, unable to find words. Back at the apartment, a voicemail waited. Sarah's voice, soft and tired, almost unrecognizable. "Dad, we moved out yesterday. Brandon found a job in Tampa, so we're starting fresh there. I wanted to tell you I understand now. About the money, about his gambling, about why you did what you did. I'm sorry it took losing the house for me to see it. I love you." I listened twice, my chest tight. Then I deleted it. Her words came too late. Sorry could not patch over the years of lies, the slammed doors, the threats to call the police on me. Consequences had arrived, and only now did she admit the truth. I sat at the desk, the sunlight spilling across the folder of final papers. The house was gone. Strangers would move in, paint the walls, plant their own flowers. The swing set I once built had been torn down years ago, but I could still see Sarah as a child, pumping her legs, shouting higher, "Daddy, higher." That memory lived in me now, not in the yard where it once stood. I stood at the window, staring at the courthouse tower, the clock hands steady and sure. The sale was over, the foundation reclaimed. Ethan's watch, his Mercedes, his games, all of it had crumbled. The man who mocked me as old-fashioned had lost everything to his own greed. And Sarah, blinded by love, had paid the price too. I breathed deep, the air of a man who had carried his burden to the end. It was not the ending I once prayed for, but it was the only one left standing. I whispered into the still apartment, more to myself than to anyone else. It is finished. The weekend after the sale, I drove out to look at condominiums on the edge of town. The air was warm, the kind of spring breeze that carried the smell of cut grass and blooming azaleas. The community was quiet, a place built for people who had already fought their battles and were ready to live out the rest of their days in peace. I parked near the clubhouse and walked the sidewalk lined with trimmed hedges, my footsteps steady, my mind oddly calm. The agent met me at the corner unit with a smile too polished, but I barely heard her words. She opened the door and stepped aside, letting me walk into the sunlight that poured across the hardwood floors. The living room was simple, the kitchen tidy, the back patio looking out over a stretch of green where golfers moved in the distance. It was the kind of place where mornings started with coffee and ended with long, quiet evenings. I could picture myself there, sitting by the window with a book, the noise of the world finally shut out. I walked from room to room, my hand brushing against the smooth walls. No memories lived here yet, no echoes of laughter or shouting, no slammed doors or whispered pleas. It was a blank page. For a man like me, who had carried the weight of 30 years in a single house, that blankness felt almost like relief. Still, as I stood in the empty bedroom, I felt something tug at me, the thought of Sarah. I wondered if she was unpacking boxes in some cramped apartment in Tampa, if she was sitting on the floor crying while Brandon promised her once again that things would get better. I wondered if she hated me, or if a part of her finally understood. Her last voicemail had been soft, tired, almost repentant. But apologies spoken into a machine were different than looking someone in the eye. I didn't call her back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. My heart still carried the sting of her words in that kitchen, the way she raised the phone against me like I was the enemy. I could forgive many things, but forgetting was harder. Some wounds don't close clean. They leave scars that catch the light no matter how long you cover them. The agent handed me a brochure, rattling off numbers, homeowners association fees, taxes, amenities. I nodded politely but barely listened. My decision wasn't about numbers anymore. It was about peace. I had defended what was mine. I had stood against lies and recklessness, and the law had sided with me. The fight was over. But the question of family remained, hanging in the air like a nail that hadn't been hammered flush. I drove back to the apartment that afternoon, the condo brochure resting on the seat beside me. Traffic moved slow, horns blaring, the city alive with noise. I thought of Sarah's first apartment years ago, how proud she had been to show me the tiny space she decorated with thrift store finds. I had smiled and told her it was perfect, even though I knew the rent was too high. I had helped her then. This time she would have to help herself. When I unlocked the door to Unit 2B, the silence greeted me again. The beige carpet, the plain furniture, the view of rooftops and asphalt. I set the brochure on the table and sat down heavily, the weight of months finally pressing into my bones. I had won, if winning meant protecting what I built. But in the process, I had lost something that no court could restore. I poured a glass of water, sat by the window, and let the fading light settle across my face. Somewhere out there, my daughter was starting over. Somewhere out there, she might be cursing my name, or maybe whispering a quiet thank you she'd never say aloud. I didn't know. I only knew that my part was done. The future stretched ahead like the blank walls of that condo, waiting to be filled. Maybe Sarah would call again. Maybe years from now she would show up at my door with different eyes, finally ready to see. Or maybe the distance would grow wider until we were strangers connected only by memory. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and breathed deep. The fight was behind me. The foundation of my life had held. And now I had to decide what to build on it. Whether forgiveness had a place in that future, or whether peace would mean learning to live without her. The night settled outside, the courthouse clock glowing faint in the distance. I whispered into the stillness, more a prayer than a declaration. I'm ready for whatever comes next. And for the first time in a long while, I almost believed it. In the end, I didn't win back my daughter's trust, but I did win back my dignity. The house that carried my sweat and sacrifice was no longer in the hands of a gambler. Justice came, not through shouting or pleading, but through patience and the law. Sarah may one day understand, or maybe she never will, but I know I stood firm when it mattered most, and sometimes that is enough. What about you, friends? Would you have done the same in my place? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.